quickly get through Recon and security. So again, this is going to be one of the easier, shorter classes because it's very linear. Everything is, very similar to down at the brigade level and battalion level. It's just one level up. Next slide. All right, so references, everything that you guys and ladies have probably seen. Next slide. Agenda. So again, we're going to talk about it, why we do it, and we're going to talk through planning and some challenges. Then we'll talk into the deep dive into the problem set a little bit, talking about task order, then some of the considerations that you have, and then we'll finish up with whatever we don't hit with the trends and best practices at the end. Next slide. All right, so reconnaissance and security in general, why do we do it? Anybody? Not a trick question.
All about understanding.
Yep, developing the situation. Why else do we, that's kind of the portion of reconnaissance. Why do we do security?
Provide flexibility, maneuver space, time.
Yep. All right, so let's go to slide 23. All right, so we'll dive deeper into recon, then we'll dive deeper into security. So again, reconnaissance, you're looking at developing the situation for the commander. What's a key distinction within LSCO when compared to COIN about the assets that the division commander is going to have at his disposal to answer his PIR, his priority intel requirements? He is a lot less, right? So it's no longer going to be the stack of ISR, theater level ISR down to the brigade level, down to the division level, all the massive amounts of UAVs that were floating above the world, looking at every single thing that he needs. Assets are going to be scarce. So therefore, a key portion of LSCO is transitioning back to fighting with the assets that you have. So as we start to talk about the why, when we look at why do we need a div recon, we want to look at because the commander has certain recon and security tasks that he needs to be able to answer him or herself with the organic assets. So again, reconnaissance, different forms of recon, route, zone, area. So a portion of the reconnaissance could be getting up to the wet gap crossing. Hey, like what's happening with Russia right now? They're all canalized on the roads because they haven't been able to, it's kind of been unseasonably warm over there, so therefore the ground is melted, therefore all their vehicles are canalized the roads, and the recon assets have to find alternate routes or bypasses for them to get around. That's why they're all canalized on one road. So, same thing, we want to, as you move up, you've got 2 up, 1 back, classic formation, so 2 VCTs abreast. You might want to, if the commander wants to prioritize getting those elements up there and not getting stuck in the micro terrain, not the unexpected river or stream that popped up or the farmer's field that was wet unexpectedly, then he deploys his reconnaissance to develop the situation. Any questions on recon? All right, let's go to 24, security. All right, so what are some examples of our classic security tasks? Definitely don't look at them up. So what do you, down at the brigade level in your experience, I know that we've got some infantry, in CAV over here. What are some type of operations that we typically conduct with security?
Screens.
Screen, all right, what's a screen?
So a screen provides early warning to the main body, and it's supported with the enablers that the BCT possesses.
Yes, sir. So you put the screen out there if you don't want the enemy to see what you're doing, so maybe you're in the defense, or as you said, sir, to protect the main body, provide early warning, the initial element. But what's a key portion of security, or of screen? What's the key characteristics of what it doesn't have and what it can't do?
It doesn't have its own. It only has the fires. Fires is the differentiator between screen guards and covers is how self-sufficient they are and what level of organic fires they come with.
Yes, sir. So again, screen needs support. It's just a speed bump. Well, hopefully it's not a speed bump. Hopefully
It's a speed bump.
you know, disengagement criteria breaks contact first. But again, it's to provide early warning for the main body or prevent the enemy, their reconnaissance assets, from determining what you're doing. All right, so screen, guard, cover. What does guard do? Anybody? Not a trick question.
Has sufficient combat power to beat all fixed elite elements.
Yeah.
Enemy ground force before it can engage the main body.
Yeah, so again, what does it do during the warfight? You're basically looking at it's protecting the flank, right? But what's the key distinction within guard and cover?
It has sufficient combat power.
So, yeah, so a guard has enough combat power to fight short term on its own, but it can't defeat anything and it can't sustain a fight onto itself. If you need something that can fight independently, then you're going back to like the ACR days and you're looking at, you know, a fully equipped, you know, it has its own indirect fire assets, it has its own, you know, likely Apaches, or, you know, it has its own air support, so it can fully fight independently. It can be out on its own and you don't have to worry about supporting it. So kind of key as we look at it, what, you know, as we're going to go back, let's go back to slide 4. So as you're looking at it from the commander's perspective, there's recon tasks, there's security tasks. What often can't, you know, the ground force do at the same time? Both. So if you don't remember anything else from my class, just remember that the div cav, which we're going to get to, whatever the recon element is out there, or security element, can't do everything at once. And that's the key takeaway from this class right there. If you don't remember anything else, if you hear div cav is going to do this, the first thing you should ask is, what else is div cav doing? Because typically they're like, you know, how many privates can you fit in an LMTV? One more. So they pile it in there, and then all of a sudden, you know, the div cav is way down. They're out doing the reconnaissance. They're out also screening that flank, or, you know, guarding that flank. And then, oh, hey, by the way, we need you to look at this boarding site, do a engineer recon, whatever it is. But the question always to ask. Next slide. All right, so intel collection. Again, the div cav, as we're leaning forward into the commander's ground reconnaissance assets, key capability is it's all weather. So when the UAVs go down, when Gray Eagle goes down, you need something that is there to look and identify what the enemy is doing, or what terrain is available. Hey, what's the boarding level? What's the bank, you know, grade? Is this a viable, you know, wet gap crossing site? Is it too wide? You know, is there unexpectedly the bridge is still up? So the commander, your CG is going to want an all-weather asset to be able to answer his PIR. Next slide. Okay, so once you've got your reconnaissance elements out there, they get given their task. So again, in your intel collection matrix, your ICM, it's got the UAVs, and then it says, you know, X unit is, you know, the div recon, the div cav. Recon task is to, you know, collect on this objective. Part of it is going to be, there's likely going to be UAVs that are going to be out in front trying to, you know, initially look. But as our battlefield framework changes and those assets need to be forward, as we just talked about in the fires fight, the biggest thing is we can't afford, if the division only has 6, 8, 12, whatever is left of the Gray Eagles, we can't have them looking at a static site for hours at a time. They can quickly do a recon of, hey, let me look overhead at this white cap site, but they're looking, you know, in a two-dimensional plane. They can't see what's going on around it, or there's fog up, or there's some, you know, weather obstruction. So you want to have an all-weather element that's down there. But the key coordination piece with that is, you know, as your Gray Eagle's up there and they do see something, how are we passing that and communicating with the div cav to let them know what's happening? And then the div cav that is working for the division, as they, you know, look at this boarding site or wet gap crossing site or this route, how are they then passing it down to the cav squadron within that SBCT, ABCT? So you as the observers there, oftentimes what you're going to see, there's going to be no plan. So the div cav will do a great job out there and find all these answers, or find this unit that maybe doesn't meet the fire's criteria, but they don't hand it over in a positive form. Hey, over the radio. Hey, over CPCE headquarters to headquarters. So there's any methods that you can use for intel handover. Could be D6 to D6, depending on what echelon and what systems you have up. But either way, it just has to be some form of positive handover. That way that intel collection that the div cav put their forces and their mission at risk for doesn't go for nothing. All right, next slide. All right, so div cav, you kind of heard me talking about it. You can quickly read the top there. First question, is the mission distinct from the assigned BCT? All right, so big thing with it, let's go to the next slide because it'll be a little bit clearer. Okay, so as you're looking at it, how familiar, have you guys heard of the div cav before? Are you guys familiar with the div cav concept? Show of hands, who is? All right, so let's do this. Let's go to slide 9, and then we'll come back up to the problem set. So, div cav. Basically, back in the more Cold War days, we used to have it, and then we cannibalized it, and then now with, I think your commander brought it up earlier, the 2028 plan, divisions are gonna have their own div cav concept. So div cavalry, which typically is about it's usually an armored element, and it is typically a task force size. So, if you think about an ABCT cav squadron, and then they add some enablers to it. Because they want it to be able to fight, not be able to fight independently, but be enough survivability and enough internal capabilities to meet the potential mission sets that it could have to do. We kind of talked about some of the potential mission sets earlier, but what do you think the division commander wants his div cav to be able to do? Yep, that's one. To support what? What type of operations? What do we want them to be able to answer or do out in front of the division? Yep, that's one. Essentially you want the div cav to be flexible enough to answer PIR for a variety of operations. So you see they've got the engineers in there. Potentially, reinforced with additional fists, potentially artillery. So you want it to have enough flexibility. Again, we're not going to build a guard and cover force, but we want it to have enough flexibility. So if it's tasked to, execute the reconnaissance for a wet cap crossing, identify the feasibility of the forward sites, it has some engineers there. It's got its own artillery. So again, it's not going to be an independent fighting force, but it has enough combat power between its tanks and its artillery to be able to fight or enough to break contact from a larger force. All right, so let's go back up to slide 8. Okay, so now you guys have kind of seen what it looks like. Let's talk about the problems. How do we task organize the div cav if we don't have one right now?
We usually pull a cap squadron out of an ABCT, so I had this afternoon the S3 for an armored cap squadron. We served as the div cav for our division. We came out of our brigade and we answered directly to the division commander. My squadron commander was the chief of Recon. And for us, critical for all of this is being tied in as the chief of Recon and the div cav initially with the division staff. It's not just a G2 problem or a G3 problem or a division commander problem. The div cav commander and his staff have to be integrated early and often to help answer these questions based off of the requirements of the division commander.
Yeah. So how did your brigade commander feel about losing his eyes and ears.
He hated it. However, there was a plugging play that needed to happen based off of the requirements. But losing a div, or losing a cap squad from div cap, then they ended up getting some other assets that helped enable him for his specific mission set. But really, like, we participated in the third ID's warfighter where they did like Korea. So for our cap squadron, we were augmented with like an infantry company, some seaburn reconnaissance, some engineer reconnaissance to be able to answer and be able to do multiple things, code reconnaissance wise, and then like hold terrain, clearing UGRs, and all that stuff. I think that's what it's called, the underground areas, UGAs, and then it's all that kind of. The sustainment piece on it really became an issue because of who was in charge of actually getting us our class 3 and 5, and then working through that problem set with our organic brigade. There's an inherent problem with that. As you alluded to, 6-7 years down the line with big cap coming up, I think it's going to be a better problem set, but stealing a cap squadron from a organic brigade is a massive thing.
Yep. All right, so let's quickly go, we'll come back to this. Let's jump forward to slide 11. Okay, so this is what he kind of talked about there. DivCav just reports directly to the division, and again, we likely pulled one of our squadrons from one of the ABCTs, tucked it directly under the division, reports directly to division, supported directly from their division. Obviously, this has problems. As you said, like if you're forward, right up near the FLOT, the forward line of troops, and then you're dependent on possibly your brigade or maybe the DSP, or like what does that command relationship look like, or the support relationship look like. So as you, the OCTs, show up at the beginning and you're figuring out, hey, you see DivCav lined out in the task org, you see it pulled from 1st Brigade, 1st AD, each warfighting function has its own piece. Hey, how are we supporting it with fires? How are we sustaining it? Is it coming directly from the DSP? Now in the real world, then you have all the maintenance, like, hey, who's getting the parts? How are they coming? Are they getting chopped a piece of the FSC? How are they going to get it? Are we pushing supplies, pulling them, whatever it is? But each warfighting function, if you want the division to be successful, has to take a hack of it. And if your primary or the person that you're working with within your warfighting function doesn't know about it or doesn't understand what their concept of support is for the DivCav, if it's reporting directly to the division command post, then it's something that you need to address early, or the division will end up significantly in a hole. All right, next slide. All right, so this is kind of like as we say, the hybrid. So again, it reports directly to the division, but it's supported from the BCT. So again, some strengths that could happen. Division likes it because they get all the reports, and then the major and the COIC, the CHOPS doesn't really care about, doesn't have to worry. I shouldn't say doesn't care. Doesn't have to worry about the sustainment piece of it, right? Now, where that's problematic is, how is that FSC or the DSP within that BCT going to push the supplies up? So how are they going to push it from the internal DSP up to the FSC for that CAV squadron? What does that look like? How long does that take? Is there ability to get the parts up there in time when they need so that the DivCav isn't broken down on the side of some road? So definitely some problems with that. And then lastly, which we don't see this too much right now, next slide should be method 3, which is the Div Recon. And this is like the lowest cost option, doesn't really cost anything. Essentially, the division just has tasking authority over each of the CAV squadrons for each of the BCTs. So as the BCTs, this looks like your classic 2 up, likely 1 back. So you have 2 BCTs, 2 ABCTs moving abreast, and the division has the ability to task them. So the negotiations with the brigade commander is, hey, I'll let you keep them, your CAV squadron, I'm not gonna take them from me, but they need to answer my PIR before your PIR. So I eat first, then you get to eat second. All right, any questions on that? Mostly what you're gonna see is call 1. All right, let's go back to slide 9, or slide 8. All right, so how do we insert the div cav? Again, mostly they're going to depart, typically the recon assets depart after mission analysis, usually when they're going to go. But again, it depends on what their pace plan is, how they're going to send communications back. Is everything established in the infrastructure ready for their departure? Do they have a clear plan of their PIR, CCIR that they need to answer? And then do they know enough of what the plan is to, if they don't have communications, to where they can still continue to gain initiative and answer the commander's questions. We kind of already looked at the command and control of it and the sustainment piece. Let's go next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so typically you're most likely not going to see, especially during the warfight, you're not going to see an air assault as a div cav. This happens if commanders, don't have an ABCT that they can pull a cav squadron from. But, because what are some issues that we would likely have if we try to air assault up at the beginning of the operation? Maybe we want to, we're at LD, we want to look at the wet gap crossing sites, because that's kind of the first decision point for the commander that we want to answer. But what's also happening right now? What are some issues that we could have? Yeah, we don't have air superiority, right? Especially at the beginning. And most likely, at least through the wet gap crossing, you're not going to have air superiority. So the thought process that you're going to, air assault the div cav, maybe the dismounted portion of like SBCT, you want that dismounted company up there to screen along the flank, or, maybe to secure a bridgehead objective and then hopefully race an SBCT up there. It's just not going to happen. They're going to get shot down on the way, and you're going to have to worry, you just lost your heavy lift and some of your airframe. And then again, as we talked about sustainment, really it's just, it has to be manageable, because oftentimes what you're going to see is an OCT, something to go down to the, if you're, like me, an ops guy, if you're the sustainment cell, or sustainment OCT, going down to whoever's pucking, or whoever's simulating the div cav, and ask them, like, what's your sustainment plan? How long do you have? How much are you SPing with? Confirm that that matches the sustainment annexes for division, and then ask them what's their plan. And then as they're continuing the operation, looking at, hey, how many DOS, how many days of supply do you have left? And then walk up to the COIC and then see if they're also tracking that. So it's ping-ponging in between the actual people that are executing and pucking, and then the division staff, and seeing, hey, do they have a realistic expectation of what's going on? Next slide. So the next piece, kind of looking at, how you control them. Again, we kind of talked about it earlier, but the div cap's going to want to be out. You're going to want to make sure that you understand, especially, they're going to be forward of all the other VCTs, so understanding where they are in space and time. We talked a little bit about it in the fires, but definitely the NFAs for their positions, if they put dismounts out to have sustained watch over the objective, making sure they're traveling. As we're also, it's incumbent both within, most of the time you're going to see the div cav reports directly to the chops and the COIC, making sure that we have essay of where they're at. And then during that op sync that occurs, usually at 3 or 4 in the morning, understanding what's coming up the next 24 hours. It's also incumbent upon them understanding where do they need to be, how long is it going to take them to get there in space and time, and then make sure that that lines up, as Colonel Johnson talked about, are those traffic control measures that's going to restrict their movement that could possibly impede them answering the CCIR, is that sync with the div cav movement? So does the div cav do we need to move up the CFL so that way the div cav can be up there and get eyes on, X objective? Any questions on that? All right, let's go next slide. So again, trends. The biggest thing that you're going to see is the div cabs will start with one thing, one objective on the SP, and then the G3 and the good idea ferries are slowly going to pile and rock in. So each day they're going to get 2 or 3 extra tasks. Oh, hey, add that as a task to the div cab. And then all of a sudden the div cab's going to be screening, the western flank. They're going to be looking at these 6 potential bridging sites. They're going to be acting, possibly as a fader demonstration force on this one, as a deception plan. And then, oh, by the way, then they need to regenerate at some time. That's kind of going to be the other thing. Eventually, even within the sustained effort that they have at being at a point of the sphere, within the op cell or within the sustainment cell or within any of the warfighting functions, hey, how are we regenerating the combat power? So when they lose class 7, how are we pushing it forward to them? Knowing that it has to go all the way up there. The best practice is, 2 or 3 days out, and then they need to have on, the SIGMAT or the VISMAT that we had earlier where it talked about each of the tasks. You should see like a black day in there for the div cab, and hopefully that's their day to regenerate combat power, get their class 7, get all their sustainment and supply, regenerate. The S1 has, 300 of their, KA wounded soldier replacements, get them all regenerated and rebuilt, and then back in the fight. But just like we're going to talk about in transitions and defense, that has to be planned out, almost like the ATO cycle. You have to plan out that regeneration day, or else, the div cab, the CG is going to want them to be at this place and at this time for this decisive operation, and then they're going to be at 30% and out of place and not in the right spot. So just like everything else that the boss talked about, synchronization, planning, and then, making sure it's nested with all the other efforts. Any questions?
Just something to add on to this, words mean something to tax squadrons and did Recon. So a lot of times staff officers, especially in the intel community, will say certain words that they believe it means something, but when it actually gets into the hands of an armored reconnaissance squadron, it means something totally different. So people look at this, make sure they're using the correct terminology for what they're trying to get answered for the commander. And then if they are going to do recon that comes from the CAF squadron, that the division staff is taking their arms around the CAF squadron staff and making them a part of the organization. Because if they don't do that, then it's easy to not take into account what that CAF squadron has to say, because it's going to affect the way that they plan current and future operations to employ them correctly or in a better manner, actually answer PIR, enable commander's decisions. And then, having them heavily involved in IC fires rehearsals and in the targeting cycle will help out tremendously the staff to be able to move and get through all the planning horizons and execution to be able to, take things off of the battlefield to help the division. That's just my 2 or 3 cents to throw in there for people to think about. And then command support relationships is really important. Terminology with that a lot of times gets lost, and then it becomes a huge conflict between the div, recon, or the CAF squadron, and they're either in the organic DCT or the division that they're supporting. So just as we're OCs looking at it, I think those are some important things to be aware of as you hear it and you go to the rehearsal. That's all.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if it's only the M2 or your maneuver OCTs looking at the div cab problem set, then, that's only about 20% of the actual problem. The ops are really going to take care of itself. It's the sustainment piece, supporting, regenerating, the fires, everything. That's really going to be what either cripples or completely enables them to be at the right place at the right time to answer the commander when he needs them. And almost guaranteed, if you aren't helping, coaching them to keep their eye on the ball, that it's going to end up as a side thought until you have that rainy day, ISR is down, or the grade goes down at 30%, there's nothing flying, and you need the go, no-go criteria for the wet cap crossing, and the div cab is off on 30% combat power.
And one additional, again, when you consider this an exercise construct, because these units are oftentimes organized out of non-habitual formations, right? The other thing, this is where you have to pay attention to your command relationships inside the sim to make sure those units do in fact get resupply and are organized correctly to the right pair of units from a behind the purpose perspective, so that all of a sudden they're not out of ammunition, they're not out of fuel, and they can do what the commander needs them to do. Thanks.
Sir? Let's go.
So I field tested one of these task orders with a warfighter a couple of years ago. When it comes to the enablers, by and large, the ground ones can fall in on that squadron and kind of SP cross LB together. What I found was a missing link was just the dedication of an aviation squadron. Otherwise, at least in my scenario, we devolved into a lead element very quickly and got away from anything to do with recon. In a way, I'd offer that an aviation squadron can help look a little bit deeper and prevent that. I don't know if we're seeing more of that, just leveraging that cab squadron more.
Yeah, I think, in LISCO, there's the tendency that you need a mass aviation that is a maneuver element, so there's somewhat of a hesitation to cut and chop or parcel it out, but that's definitely somewhere, depending on how much the division commander wants to invest into it. We've definitely seen them give them an Apache troop, so I don't know if you list.
So if, based off how the Apache works, it's really hard to get too far forward. That doesn't work as well as the Kiowa did back when some of us were younger and it was a far more flexible platform. So it's got a long way to go back. On the cab side, it's very hard for them to sustain, and it takes about the entire air CAF squadron in order to support that div CAF squadron. At least 2 troops if you're going to have 24/7 coverage, and then the shadow on top of it. So it's a significant bill for that division commander to pay, but they need to be linked in, and they need to be linked in well, and that the command and support relationship needs to be the right one so that the person utilizing them understands what they're doing. One thing that typically ends up happening is there's not much of a plan to utilize those aircraft during the warfighter, and the division commander goes, "Hey, cab, are those aircraft being utilized?" And the cab commander's like, "Not really," because the div cab's afraid to lose them. So the division commander will go, "I'm not afraid to lose them," and commits them somewhere else. So if you don't have a plan for that aircraft squadron and what they're going to assist the div cab on the ground side do, it's just like, hey, I got an extra toy, but I'm not sure what I'm doing with it, and the effect goes away. You have to be very deliberate as to the task and purpose. Anytime you task organize and you do the relative combat power assessment, you need to be very deliberate about what it is that is doing for that. And then, because the person creating that div cab isn't commanding the div cab. So that needs to be clearly linked to this enabler gives you this capability, task it to do that.
Okay, let's go to slide 21. Sir, closing comments?
So, hey, pull up slide, it's 89 in my book, but it's a division caliber planning considerations. So, when they build the div cap, what are they building it for? Okay, fundamentally, they'll build it because they feel like they have to have a div cap, but they don't know what mission they're going to give them. Does everybody understand? So, it's vitally important that
That one?
the
Okay.
planning considerations, that they understand what they're planning for and then build the unit to be able to do that. Does that make sense? Whether it's aviation or field artillery or whatever, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter how they're going to do it, but they have to do something, because there's a problem set out there that if they don't do one of those 3 courses of action that we gave you, that you guys can look at and then help coach, But at the end of the day, if they don't pick one, they're gonna get punched in the face, right? And we're trying to avoid that. What they'll do historically is they'll either put too much there or too little. Because they didn't understand the mission that they were gonna give them to begin with. Does that make sense? So asking them these questions, you know, will help structure a good conversation around it. Good? Oh, shit.
13, sir, 1300?
18, yeah, 1,300 back in here, we'll continue